This is a before and after photo of Ephesus, a city in modern-day Turkey that is today in ruins but was once one of the most thriving cities in all of the ancient world. The street here is known as the Marble Road, which weaved its way by an agora to a library known as the Library of Celsus, the second largest in the Roman Empire. Ephesus sat on the Mediterranean Ionian coast in Greece and became a thriving, inherited city of the expanding Roman Empire. The city also housed one of the ancient world's most famous structures, the Temple of Artemis, and those who once walked its streets include Alexander the Great, Cleopatra, and John the Baptist. The Temple of Artemis was once one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world and would have looked something like this in its heyday. It housed over 100 of those massive pillars that you see. All that remains today are some of the ruins of its foundation in one lone pillar. Let's take a tour of this ancient city, thanks in part to this amazing reconstruction of what the city might have looked like. I'll link to the video below. As a brief disclaimer, the video reconstructs the city from the Roman reign, which began in 129 CE, but of course had existed for centuries before. Unlike so many other cities and civilizations, the Romans never had to conquer Ephesus. They inherited it. The last ruler of the city, Attalus, king of Pergamon, bequeathed the city to the Romans in 129 CE, and the Romans made the city even more incredible during its centuries-long rule. To begin, Roman engineers constructed an artificial port to make exporting and importing goods easier. This is what Ephesus would have looked like as you approached the city and crossed the harbor to the port gate entrance. First thing you saw when you entered this city was the Arcadian, named after the emperor Arcadius. Traders would sell their goods in the arcades on the left and right. Oil lamps would have lit up the streets at night. This is what the Arcadian looks like today. And as the Romans often did, they built bathhouses and theaters, and the ones they built in Ephesus were some of the best constructed. Today, these structures are in ruins. However, the theater is still in pretty decent shape. As you can see, much of the top half of the famous Arcadian Theater facade is gone. The stadium seating remains in fairly good condition. Same can't be said for the bathhouses, unfortunately. The Romans were obsessed with public bathhouses and gymnasiums. The Ephesian Gymnasium, built between 146 and 149 CE, was exceptionally well designed. The facility's best feature was a courtyard where people could participate in sporting activities. The baths were also remarkable that lasted from 140 CE to around 500 CE. While the Roman bathhouse and gymnasium did their job well, the Arcadian Theater was in a league of its own. The theater could seat up to 25,000 spectators, which is impressive even by modern standards. NFL stadiums today seat upwards of 70,000. Its theater building was extraordinary as well. Scholars have recreated what the building probably looked like in its heyday when it was the background to all sorts of historic events. The Greeks used the Arcadian Theater for plays, of course, but the theater also put on public meetings and gladiator fights. One public meeting in particular is pretty famous. The 1st century CE, the Apostle Paul was brought to the Arcadian Theater for a public trial. The city accused him of taking away the local silversmith's business because new Christian converts had stopped buying tiny silver Artemis figures. That decision was made right here in the theater. The theater that Paul and so many others saw eventually deteriorated and fell into ruin. By the time the Byzantines ruled Ephesus in the 6th century, the theater was basically in ruins. The former theater building was a crumbled mess on top of the seats. The famous Ephesian marble street is the road starting from the Great Theater and leading to the Celsus Library, eventually leading all the way to the Temple of Artemis. The construction of the marble road dates to the 1st century AD. It was rebuilt in the 5th century. The western side of the road is enclosed by the agora wall, and on the wall is a higher platform which was constructed during the reign of Nero. It was built over the wall for pedestrians. Interesting side note, there are some drawings on the marble road believed to be an advertisement of the brothel. This advertisement is thought to be one of the first known advertisements in history. The end of the street, of course, is the famous Library of Celsus, built by the governor Celsus at the end of the 2nd century. Interestingly, while serving as a library, it also serves as the governor's tomb. In the ancient times, you would have walked up the steps to enter the library that held upwards of 12,000 scrolls. The main floor was apparently a reading room that was lit by natural light. You couldn't check out books because copies of books in the ancient days were, of course, incredibly time-intensive. The scrolls of manuscripts were kept in cupboards in the niches of the walls. There were double walls behind the bookcases to prevent them from the extremes of temperature and humidity. It was the 3rd richest library in the ancient times, behind Alexandria and Pergamum. The library lasted about 150 years until it fell into ruins when it was destroyed by fire, either from Goth invasion or earthquake. Interestingly, it's unclear whether this was due to either, given both of which hit the city in the year 262 AD. The library building formed the western end of a street that was lined with tombs and memorials in the houses of the rich. For example, this octagonal building was most likely the tomb of Cleopatra's sister. These are the ruins today of that tomb. According to legend, Arsinoe IV was taking refuge in the Temple of Artemis in 41 BC. This is the same year Cleopatra and her lover Mark Antony arrived in the city. Arsinoe is said to have opposed Cleopatra's rule and the dream her eldest sister had of uniting Egypt and Rome into a single global empire. When Mark Antony and Cleopatra defeated her forces, she was exiled to Ephesus, and Cleopatra later came to view her as a threat and thus had her sister murdered. Switching topics, ancient Ephesus was covered by many wells which fed into the city via an elaborate system of aqueducts. Fresh water from the outskirts of the city was fed on these aqueducts into a central well, which was then distributed to much of the rest of the city. We'll conclude the tour with two of the city's most famous structures. We'll start with the Basilica of St. John, but of course, we won't forget one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world. Byzantines made a powerful mark on the legacy of Ephesus. The Basilica of St. John's was a building ordered by the Emperor Justinian to honor St. John, who is believed to have been buried there. Due to the important figures involved, the basilica was designed and decorated lavishly. The designers were inspired by the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople and made sure to implement the high golden ceilings and intricate architecture found in the city. Builders also made sure to create a small monument over the alleged burial place of St. John. Eventually, the basilica replaced the now defunct Temple of Artemis as the focus of Ephesus until the Seljuk Empire conquered the city in 1304 CE. From there, the Ottoman Empire absorbed the territory, and Ephesus was abandoned in the 15th century, leaving it to ruin into the remains we see today. Ephesus was known for its Artemis cult, who was a revered goddess in Greek mythology. Their most prized possession of the city was the Temple of Artemis. When King Croesus invaded the city, Herodotus says the Ephesians tied at least 4,000 feet of rope from the temple to the city to show their dedication to Artemis, and hopefully prevent the Lydian king from destroying the temple. But Croesus burned down the temple anyway and ordered the construction of a new one, the one that became the 7th wonder of the world. Before the 19th century, all we had were fantastical descriptions of the temple. The ancient writer Pliny the Younger described the temple as the most magnificent and wonderful monument ever built by the Greeks. This is a sentiment echoed by many other writers. Pliny even provided us with a rough measurement of the temple. Though his numbers may be slightly exaggerated, he says it was 425 feet long, 225 feet wide, which was almost double the size of the Parthenon in Athens. It also had an astounding 127 columns. Each column stood 60 feet high and 4 feet in diameter. These massive columns were organized in double rows along all 4 sides of the temple. There were 8 to 9 columns on the short sides and 20 to 21 on the long sides. As if the sheer size wasn't enough, Pliny wrote that the outer columns had ornate sculptures of figures from Greek mythology like Hermes, Hades, and the reluctant wife, Persephone. Besides being a magnificent structure, the temple became the center from which the rest of Ephesus was built. Because of the city's close ties to the temple, its overall structure didn't change too drastically until the Roman occupation in the 2nd century. Though the site is still vast, archaeologists estimate that only 10 to 15% of the site has been excavated. For example, this is the Arcadian Theater that we showed you earlier, before and after excavations, which in large part took place in the 1900s. We'll leave you with a few more before and after shots of the great ancient city.